What if everything you think you know about sleep is only the outermost layer of something far more profound? Most people understand sleep as biological rest, memory consolidation, the brain's nightly maintenance cycle, and all of that is real. But it is the thinnest possible explanation, describing the plumbing without ever touching what is actually happening at the level of consciousness itself. There is something far deeper occurring every single night beneath those surface explanations, something ancient traditions mapped with extraordinary precision thousands of years ago, and something quantum physics has now confirmed through rigorous replicated science. Tonight, we are going through every layer together, from neuroscience to quantum mechanics, to the unanimous testimony of ancient wisdom, arriving at a core experiential truth that will permanently change how you understand sleep, consciousness, and ultimately yourself. Stay with this completely. Let's start where science starts, with what sleep does to the body and brain. Memory consolidation, where the brain decides what to keep from the day and what to release. Glymphatic waste clearance, where cerebrospinal fluid flushes out the toxic byproducts of waking neural activity. Hormone regulation, immune function, emotional processing. The brain sorts through every experience, files what matters and discards what doesn't. This is all real. This is all confirmed. And none of it is what this video is actually about. Because here is the problem with the biological explanation. It describes the plumbing. It tells you what sleep maintains and repairs. But it says almost nothing about what is actually happening at the level of consciousness when the waking mind releases its grip. It describes the container without ever asking what is inside it. And what is inside it changes everything. But here is where the understanding deepens considerably. Sleep is not a passive dimming of consciousness. It is an active transformation of it. The brain does not simply quiet down when you close your eyes. It shifts into radically different modes of processing, modes that are entirely unavailable during ordinary waking awareness. And these modes are not background operations running quietly beneath the surface of what matters. They are more fundamental to the formation of your identity, your beliefs, your emotional reality, and your capacity to experience the world than nearly anything that happens while you are awake. To understand this, we need to look at the actual architecture of consciousness during sleep. It begins at a specific threshold, one that most people pass through every single night without ever noticing. The hypnagogic threshold. The luminous borderland between waking and sleeping, where your brainwaves begin slowing from the fast active beta frequencies of ordinary thinking into the slower, wider alpha waves of deep relaxation. At the hypnagogic threshold, something measurable and neurologically significant occurs. The critical faculty, the part of the mind that filters and decides what is real, begins to relax its grip. As brainwaves slow from alpha into theta, the brain enters a hyper-associative state, forming connections between concepts, memories, emotions, and sensory experiences that the logical waking mind would never permit. This is not metaphor. This is confirmed neuroscience. The strange and meaningful images arising in the falling asleep space are not random noise. They are the mind operating without the filter of rational consciousness, reaching depths the surface mind simply cannot access during ordinary waking hours. Moving deeper beyond this threshold, we enter slow wave sleep, where something even more extraordinary unfolds. Neurons across vast regions of the brain begin firing in coordinated, synchronized waves, a phenomenon of massive neural synchronization that does not merely maintain who you are, but actively restructures it. In deep, slow wave sleep, something extraordinary is happening beneath every biological explanation. Neurons across vast regions of the brain fire in coordinated waves, literally restructuring the neural architecture of who you are. This is not metaphor. Synaptic connections are selectively reinforced or pruned. Emotional charges attached to memories are modulated. The deep habitual neural pathways that determine how you automatically interpret experience, what you believe about yourself, and what you consider possible, are being reinforced or weakened based on what the sleeping brain consolidates. Here is the striking truth that neuroscience rarely states plainly. The person who wakes up in the morning is not the same neural configuration that went to sleep. You are being rewritten every single night without exception. Which means the critical question is not whether this rewriting is happening. It is happening regardless. The critical question is what determines the direction of that nightly rewriting, and whether you have any conscious participation in it. Now we arrive at REM sleep, the most mysterious and significant phase of the entire cycle. The dream state. On the surface, neuroscience explains REM as emotional memory processing and creative problem solving. Matthew Walker's research confirms this with extraordinary precision. History supports it too. Kekule discovered the structure of the benzene ring through a dream. Paul McCartney heard the complete melody for Yesterday upon waking. Thomas Edison deliberately used the hypnagogic threshold, holding steel balls in his hands, so that the moment he drifted into sleep, they would drop and wake him, allowing him to harvest the creative intelligence of that boundary state. These are not coincidences. They are glimpses of something the neuroscience rarely addresses in plain language. The dreaming brain is not a degraded version of the waking brain. It is a fundamentally different mode of consciousness, operating by entirely different rules, with access to entirely different capacities that the waking mind simply cannot reach. In the dreaming state, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational self-monitoring consciousness, is significantly deactivated. What becomes active instead is the default mode network, the same network associated with deep meditation, creative flow, and profound self-understanding. This is not a degradation of consciousness. It is a different mode of consciousness entirely. The dreaming mind is not irrational. It is differently rational, processing reality through pattern recognition, symbolic association, and direct experiential knowing rather than linear logic. Without the filter of the conditioned waking self, the dreaming mind reaches the beliefs beneath the beliefs, the self beneath the self-concept. And here is what the neuroscience rarely states plainly. What the dreaming mind does with that access every single night is not merely process and file experiences away. It is actively constructing the reality the person will wake up into. The dreaming mind is not reviewing your life. It is quietly, powerfully, authoring the next chapter of it. Now here is where this goes somewhere most people do not expect, and it is important to be precise about what follows. This is not metaphor. This is not poetic borrowing from science to make a spiritual point feel more credible. What follows is literal, confirmed, replicated scientific finding. At the subatomic level, particles do not have definite positions until they are observed. Before observation, a particle exists in superposition, meaning it simultaneously occupies multiple possible states at once. The double-slit experiment makes this undeniable. When electrons are fired without observation, they produce an interference pattern, behaving exactly like a wave passing through both slits simultaneously. The moment a detector is placed to observe which slit the electron passes through, that interference pattern vanishes entirely. The act of observation collapses superposition. Consciousness does not passively witness physical reality. Consciousness participates in collapsing quantum possibility into physical actuality. That is not philosophy. That is the finding. Now here is where everything converges. Your waking mind observes reality through a conditioned filter built from past experience, habitual belief, and the constant narrative of the self-concept. This filter is not neutral. It collapses the quantum field of possibility into actualities consistent with what the conditioned mind already believes to be true. Every moment of waking life, you are confirming the reality you already know, collapsing infinite potential into the familiar and expected. Then sleep arrives. The filter drops. The prefrontal cortex deactivates. The critical faculty relaxes its grip, and in that opening, the quantum field of possibility expands again. The dreaming mind, freed from ordinary waking observation, operates in modes far more consistent with the quantum mechanical description of reality, holding multiple simultaneous possibilities without collapsing them into a single definite outcome. This is not poetry. This is the literal architecture of what happens every single night inside your consciousness. Every night when you fall asleep, something profound happens beneath the biological explanations. You are temporarily released from the collapsed version of reality your conditioned waking mind has been maintaining. You are returned briefly to the field, that layer beneath the surface where nothing is yet determined, and everything remains pure potential. What you bring into that field matters enormously. The state of consciousness you carry, the emotional frequency you inhabit, the quality of intention and awareness you hold. All of this participates in determining what collapses back into actuality when you wake. This is not poetic language. This is the literal mechanics of consciousness meeting quantum reality every single night without exception. And here is what makes this even more extraordinary. This understanding is not new. Ancient wisdom traditions across thousands of years of direct experiential investigation already knew this with remarkable precision. What we call modern science has simply confirmed what they never stopped teaching. Across every major wisdom tradition on Earth, sleep has never been understood as mere biological rest. The Vedic tradition mapped 4 states of consciousness, including prajna, the deep dreamless sleep state described as pure awareness without content, a direct encounter with the ground of all being. The ancient Egyptians built dream temples where ritual sleep was practiced as a sacred technology for accessing deeper knowledge and healing. The ancient Hebrews understood dreams as the primary channel through which deeper layers of reality communicate with ordinary consciousness. The Islamic tradition preserved the concept of the true dream, and Sufi mystics developed elaborate practices for working with the hypnagogic threshold as a doorway to an intermediate realm between the physical and the divine. These were not primitive attempts at explaining the unknown. These were sophisticated, refined systems built from thousands of years of direct experiential investigation into the nature of consciousness itself. Indigenous traditions across the Americas, Australia, Africa, and the Pacific all contained sophisticated understandings of sleep and dreaming as access to hidden layers of reality. The Aboriginal Australian concept of the dream time is not merely mythology about the past. It is a description of a stratum of existence that underlies and generates the visible world, most directly accessible through the altered consciousness of the dream state. What all these traditions share across thousands of years, and every culture on Earth, with no contact between them, is the understanding that sleep is a doorway, not a shutdown. A passage to layers of reality the waking surface mind simply cannot access on its own. Quantum mechanics has now confirmed that this ancient understanding is not superstition. It is an accurate description of the architecture of consciousness, arrived at through thousands of years of direct experiential investigation, long before any laboratory existed to measure it. Let me bring this into the personal, into the lived and felt, through someone named Sarah. Sarah carried a belief so deeply embedded in her identity that she had never identified it as a belief. She experienced it as reality. The quiet, unexamined sense that she was someone things happened to, rather than someone who generated circumstances. This belief shaped everything beneath the surface of her functional, coherent waking life. Sarah began paying attention to the hypnagogic threshold, not to her dreams or deep sleep, but to that specific luminous space of the falling asleep moment. In that threshold, thoughts arose she would never have permitted while fully awake. Possibilities her waking mind would have immediately dismissed. And genuine organic feelings of capacity and belonging surfaced from somewhere beneath the conditioned self-concept. Something real was waiting beneath the surface. It had always been there. Sarah began to consciously inhabit the threshold rather than letting it pass unconsciously. Night after night, she found the same thing beneath the surface belief, a deeper, truer belief that she was at her core, a generative presence, someone who shaped reality rather than merely inhabiting it. This deeper belief had not been constructed through reasoning or affirmation. It had simply been there beneath the surface, waiting for the threshold state to make it accessible. As she consistently arrived at the membrane between the surface and the depth with awareness, the nightly neural rewiring had a direction. The deep current began rising to the surface. And here is what Sarah discovered that applies directly to you. Beneath every surface belief about who you are and what is possible, there is a deeper layer. And beneath that, another. And at the deepest layer, something that has never been touched by any conditioning whatsoever. Understanding why the threshold matters requires understanding what happens neurologically at that precise moment. As brainwaves slow from alpha into theta, something extraordinary occurs. The critical faculty, that relentless internal editor, deciding what is real and what is possible, substantially reduces its activity. The default mode network activates. Neuroplasticity reaches its daily peak. Whatever enters awareness at this threshold carries disproportionate weight, directly shaping the neural architecture reinforced throughout the deep sleep that follows. Every ancient wisdom tradition understood this intuitively. The Vedic tradition explicitly taught that the final thought before sleep determines both the quality of sleep and the nature of waking. This was not poetic suggestion but practical instruction. The Talmudic tradition prescribes specific evening prayers and mental states before sleep. Christian mystical practice developed elaborate night offices and contemplative preparations. Islamic tradition established detailed rituals of purification and intention before sleeping. Separated by centuries and continents, each tradition arrived at identical understanding. The consciousness brought to sleep fundamentally shapes what sleep does. Consider Theo, who spent years trying to change through discipline, willpower, and the accumulation of better habits. He made real measurable progress on the surface. He was more productive, more organized, more consistent. But something beneath remained stubbornly unchanged, a felt sense of being slightly behind, of being someone always becoming rather than someone who had arrived. No amount of surface effort could reach it because he had been working on the surface without ever reaching the layer where the felt sense of self is actually generated. Then insomnia arrived, not as an obstacle but as an unexpected doorway. Forced to spend long, uncomfortable hours suspended at the threshold, something happened that no deliberate effort had produced. He began hearing something quieter beneath the familiar voices of his internal narrative, a quality of awareness communicating in felt knowing rather than words. He had already arrived. The sense of lack was a surface phenomenon. Beneath it there was no lack at all. What Theo discovered and what Sarah found before him points to something that unfolds gradually, not in a single night, but across weeks and months of consistent conscious arrival at the threshold. The first thing that changes is the threshold itself. It becomes more recognizable, more accessible. You begin to find it reliably rather than stumbling through it unconsciously. The second shift is in the content. As surface residue clears, deeper material emerges. The felt sense of the self beneath the self-concept. A spaciousness wider than ordinary conditioned identity. Something quieter and more fundamental than the familiar voice of the thinking mind. The third shift is perhaps the most significant. The boundary between threshold experience and waking experience begins to blur, not in a disorienting way but in a stabilizing one. The openness available at the threshold begins appearing in waking moments, in stillness, in the spaces between thoughts. The depth rises not because it has changed, but because the surface has become more permeable. So here is the question worth asking directly. Is any of this real, or is it sophisticated wishful thinking dressed in scientific language? The quantum mechanics is real, confirmed by thousands of replicated experiments, underlying every piece of modern technology from semiconductors to medical imaging. This is not fringe science. It is the most precisely verified framework in the history of physics. The neuroscience is real. Supported by decades of sleep research conducted in laboratories around the world, documented in peer-reviewed journals, replicated across cultures and populations. The ancient traditions are real, representing thousands of years of direct experiential investigation into the nature of consciousness by some of the most rigorous minds in human history. What is being offered here is the synthesis of these three bodies of knowledge into a coherent understanding that none of the three reveals with full clarity alone. Sleep is the nightly passage through the membrane between the surface of reality and the quantum field of pure potential beneath it, and the quality of consciousness brought to that passage participates in determining what becomes real on the other side. Every layer explored tonight was always pointing to the same core. Beneath the biological maintenance was the architecture of consciousness during sleep. Beneath the neuroscience was quantum mechanics, probability collapsing into actuality through observation. Beneath the quantum mechanics was the ancient wisdom, the unanimous testimony of every major tradition across every culture, that sleep is a sacred passage through the membrane between surface and depth. Beneath the ancient wisdom was the experiential truth that the depth is always there, that the surface self is the thinnest outermost layer of what a person actually is. And every single night, without exception, the return to the field is offered. At the core of everything explored is this recognition. The self is not a fixed entity. It is a dynamic quantum process, continuously collapsing out of infinite potential into the specific experience of being this particular person, in this particular life, at this particular moment. Tonight is not just another night. In the literal quantum mechanical sense, it is a new beginning. The surface self you have carried through this day will dissolve back into the field. The neural architecture will be modified. The collapse that produces tomorrow's version of you has not yet occurred. You are invited to arrive at the threshold tonight without effort, without performance, without trying to make something happen. Simply arrive with awareness, with the quiet, grounded recognition of what the threshold actually is and what the depth actually holds. Night by night, layer by layer, the surface becomes more transparent and the depth more accessible, until one morning you wake from the depth rather than the surface, with the quiet, unmistakable certainty of something that has always been true finally being recognized. Share this transmission with someone ready to hear it. And watch the next video on intuition, the hidden layer of perception that has been deliberately suppressed.